Well, here I am up in the shed, guys, and I'm just putting out another, this will probably be a good 10, 12, 15 minute video. And it's about the correct use of moisture meters for measuring the moisture content of timber, whether it's firewood or lumber that you've sawn, or in this case, this is a hardwood flooring, tongue and groove hardwood flooring. This particular one's a hardwood, it's Jarrah, West Australian Jarrah, Eucalyptus marginata. And a lot of the videos I see say that, you know, you turn your moisture meter on and you read the meter at the top there somewhere and it says, oh, that's about 14% in the green. So it is dry and 14% is not bad, but this is a non-destructive moisture meter. So if I lift it off there and turn it over, it's got rubber impedance pads on the bottom. So this one you can use to measure the moisture content on expensive timbers. It's non-destructive. A lot of the cheaper moisture meters have two nails sticking out the top, and you drive those nails into the timber and they measure the impedance between the two nails. But they put holes in the timber, and if you want to use that bit of timber in feature grade furniture or so on, then you probably don't want a destructive moisture meter. And if you're doing tests, for example, on high value lumber like walnut or Jarrah or whatever, and you're doing it in a kiln and you're doing it every day, well, your timber, if you're using the destructive meters with the nails, your timber's going to come out looking like a pegboard with pinholes everywhere in it. So I prefer to use this particular non-destructive impedance-based meter. So this one's just read about, I think we said 14 roughly on the Jarrah. I go over, this is another piece of timber. This one's a softwood. This one's called she oak, Allocasuarina fraseriana. And it's reading a bit higher, it's reading about 16%. Now, to give you an idea of just how sensitive these meters are, my hand, if I put it under here, your body's made up of about 70% moisture. And if I place my hand under this piece of wood, you'll see that the needle moves ever so slightly. And that's through a good 3 or so inches of timber. If I bring that one back to the floorboard, which is only ½ inch thick, or less, it's a 3/4 inch thick, 18 millimeters. Back to our 14, bring the hand up underneath, and you can see it's measuring enough moisture in my hand to go right through to the green or wet timber. So they're a fairly sensitive meter, and that gives you an indication. They're also fairly accurate. But the problem I'm having with a lot of the videos I'm seeing is that there's a little bit more to it than just turning on the meter and saying, well, that's the percentage. And it's an easy trap to fall into, and a lot of people do so. But these expensive meters, this is a US brand, Tramex. It's manufactured in Ireland. I think they manufacture over there due to tax incentives. They supply with the meter this piece of paper, or it's actually a, here's my hand, it's a printout, several pages. And what it does is it provides correction factors, selected species correction data for impedance moisture meter. And the point that I'm trying to make, I guess, in this video is that all meters are graduated for one specific softwood timber called pine, Pinus radiata. And there are variations in the actual moisture content or the impedance factors of pine, depending on where it's grown. If I go to the correction factors on this one, for pine, we can see there's all sorts of pines. There's loblolly pine, clinky pine, K. William pine, Huon pine from Tassie, hoop pine, cypress pine, white cypress, and so it goes on. And there are pines, radiata, grown in South Australia and Victoria, and pine slash, sugar pine, white pine, and they all have a different correction factor. So you've got to apply the right correction factor for the timber species that you're measuring. That first one that we measured was something called Jarrah, West Australian Jarrah, and it's on the list here. You can see I've got an asterisk because I use that species a fair bit. Tells you the specific gravity, 0.82 or 820 kilograms per cubic metre. And it tells you that when you're getting a reading of about, I think we said 14, if I come down the correction list to Jarrah, that I've got to correct a little bit more than 4.5%, and it's heading towards 5. So let's leave it at 4.5 is near enough. So 4.5%, and if you look on this list, it does tell you, got to find it, plus or minus, whether you've got to add that or subtract it. And you can see that these correction factors have got minuses in front of them. So the one for Jarrah is a minus. So I'd have to take 4.5% off that reading of 14. So that's actually 9.5% moisture content. So it's nowhere near what the meter says. And if we did it again, going back from the Jarrah, and we move it over onto the she oak, we're looking at 16 on the she oak. And when I go back to my list and I turn over and look for that particular species, she oak, West Australian, it's a softwood, but it's also a little bit less dense than the Jarrah at 820. This is 730 kilos per cubic metre. So it's a fairly dense softwood, which is why it's also very stable, and it gets used in boat building in this area a lot. And we said we had a reading of 16, and we'd come down the correction factor chart for WA she oak, and you can see that we've got to remove somewhere between 3 and 3.5, and it's closer to 3.5, so we'll work with 3.5. 3.5 off the meter reading of 16 would leave you 12.5. 12.5 is the equilibrium moisture content, average for use for timber on the Swan Coastal Plain, which is where Perth, Western Australia, where I am. So that would be suitable for use in a floor, for example, in Perth in a non-evaporative air conditioned building. But the moisture content there, you couldn't sell that if you just read the meter. You've actually got to apply the correction factors. Here in WA, if you sell firewood, because we have smog issues in winter with inversion layers, it's a population of 2 million people, the Environmental Protection Authority specify with firewood that it must be less than 15%. Now, if you're measuring straight off the meter and you're getting it wrong, and you sell that firewood to somebody and they put it in their slow combustion stove, and the stove goes out and it smokes up and it soots the chimney and puts out smog everywhere, and then they complain to the EPA, well, the EPA will come around and surreptitiously buy a little bit of firewood off you, and they'll go and do the scientific testing and apply the correction factors, and if it's over 15%, you'll end up with a fine. So the point of making this video, I guess, is that it's important to understand that it's not just a question of going to your local Bunnings in Australia or Walmart or whatever it is in America and buying the cheapest destructive moisture meter that comes with no correction factors and just reading the meter and saying, yeah, mate, she's good to go. It's less than 15%. You're all set to go. The reality is there could be 4 or 5% different depending on the correction factors and the species of timber that you're selling. And without knowing that, you can be supplying firewood that's wet and green and not having happy customers. Or you could be using a timber that particularly if I bought all this equipment, these are not cheap. These are about $600 or $700 Australian, these meters. And I bought this because I used to run a timber seasoning kiln for about 15 or 20 years, and I was measuring moisture content of timber in that kiln every single day. And so it needed to be accurate in order to run a kiln drying schedule. But I guess the point is that you can't just read the meter, people. They're all graduated to that one timber, pine, softwood. And if you're testing other timbers, whether it's, cherry or I don't know what other timbers you guys have got over there, but if you're testing other timbers, you need to get a correction factor chart and you need to apply the correction factor. And lastly, there's an additional correction factor, which I'm sure you can look up on the internet if you're keen. you've actually got to correct once more. Once you've applied the species correction factor, you've got to apply a correction factor for ambient temperature. So from right down at 0 at freezing and right up to a hot day, you know, 100 and here in WA in Western Australia, we've had days recently as high as 120 Fahrenheit. So you've got to have the correction factor. However, the correction factor for temperature is usually only somewhere between 1 and 2%, and it's either plus or minus. So there's nowhere near as big a swing in correction factors for temperature as what there are for the incorrect species. So you really need to apply both correction factors if you want to be accurate. When I was applying the correction factor, because it was coming out of a kiln that at the end of the drying schedule was up around 100 Fahrenheit, or a little bit higher actually, about 105, 108 Fahrenheit every day, I had to apply both the species correction factor and also the temperature correction factor to get an accurate moisture meter reading. So that's the purpose of this video, is to just correct this misunderstanding that seems to be growing day by day on YouTube with people who buy a cheap moisture meter and proceed to tell all and sundry how to use it. And the reality is that the bulk of the ones I've seen are all wrong. So there it is, people, how to use your moisture meter correctly. Hope that's helpful to somebody. Cheers.